Today I'm going to talk about coming out of the mind and what that really means. So it's something that I talk about over and over in these videos. And I wanted to go into that a little more deeply and talk about that a little bit more directly. So the first thing I wanted to discuss is just the limits of the mind. In a simple way, if you think about how your mind works and how thought works, right? Thoughts are almost like individual units. Each thought is focused on a specific thing, a specific concept, a specific issue. You can't have a thought about everything at once. Thought is focused in pieces, which is very practically useful for taking things apart, either concretely or conceptually, and rebuilding them. So it's very good for technological development, which requires that you break things down into pieces and then learn how to reassemble them in ways that are useful to you. So thought is very good for survival. It's very good for reconfiguring material reality in a way that we want. That's great. That has its place. But thought is not very good at understanding reality in a more essential way, because in a world that's constantly changing and is never fixed, right? Reality is never actually fixed. It's always in a state of change. An instrument like the mind that always sees things in parts, because that's just how it works. It understands static things. That's how it conceptualizes. An instrument that works like that is just not able to really fathom or conceive of reality on a more profound level, on a more realistic and essential level. So the biggest problem or suffering that comes out of the mind is that we don't just use the mind to practically reconfigure pieces of reality. We start to try to find our own identity, who we are, through the mind. And so we look at all these different things. It could be our appearance, it could be our personality, our idea of our personality, it could be our place in society, our status, our social context. All of these things, or actually what we own is a big one, right? And we create our identities statically as a collection of all of these things. And we say, this is who I am. Even if we don't say that consciously, we create that reality for ourselves unconsciously. And we know that's going to change. So as it starts to change, we partly fight with that change because we want to hold on to an identity, a static identity that we've created through thought. And we partly adapt to that change by creating new thoughts that correspond to new realities. So when we're engaged in thought, when we're identified with thought, when we create our sense of self through thought, we're always finding ourselves in so many different fragments that we try to hold on to, but it's against the nature of reality for anything to be static. Nothing is going to be the same forever. So our identity that's put together through all these pieces that we can only understand mentally as static is inherently unstable. When you are identified with a piece of reality as though it's static, when you know even conceptually that that's going to change, that it's not really static, that that's a fiction that you're creating. You're in love with a fiction. Your whole identity is invested in a fiction, in an idea of something fixed or static that cannot possibly actually be that way. So at the extreme end of that, you create this static idea of something in your head. And when it starts to slip out of your grasp, because that's just what reality does, it's always changing, it's not fixed. When it starts to slip out of your grasp, out of that mental image, you freak out. You fight for it, you try to hold on, you dig into that identity, and you do everything you can to try to force this changing reality back into this fixed structure that you've identified with. Of course, that's absolutely impossible, and you're just going to cause yourself suffering because reality's already moved on. It doesn't care what you're thinking about it. Life changes, things change. You can try to rope them in as much as you want, and maybe there will be some success, but eventually everything's just going to run through your hands like sand or water. You can't hold it, right? Change is going to happen. We're all going to age. We're all going to die. There's nothing that can stop that constant movement. And when we create an identity, even identifying with this body, this form, what we own, we're creating a really fragile identity ultimately. Because even if you're the richest man in the world, if you're living through that thought identity, it's all still going to go. At some point you're going to die. The world is unstable. Maybe you'll lose your wealth. One way or another, that fixed reality that you are trying to hold on to is going to go. And if you're invested in it, that's just really terrifying. And it's the cause of a lot of suffering, of really all of the suffering globally. It's all about people trying to hold on to images of things that are not real. They don't correspond to reality, which is always changing. And that's just about the structure of our minds, the structure of thought. So almost totally by accident, the way that our minds work does not correspond to reality. And when we invest in those ideas and those thoughts, we just accidentally set ourselves up for a disaster because we're fighting against the nature of things. We're just fighting against the reality of how things work. And we can't win because reality is so much bigger than we are. When you let go of so much identification with that fragmentary mental understanding of reality, and you open into an experience of something that's more essential than thought. You open into an experience of being, of something that isn't just a fragmented experience of the world, but is just a self-experience, right? You start to feel an aliveness, a presence, an awakeness underlying things. That presence is not a thing. It's not a form. It's not something fixed. It's like you start to experience a living field beyond all of the forms it takes. You start to feel something so much more essential and alive than all of its surface forms. And that experience of the self is much more secure because it just is. It's not dependent on a particular structure, a particular configuration of reality. So that essential identity and experience of yourself is not dependent on what's happening. It's not dependent on what forms are around you. It just is. No matter what's happening on the form level, there's an experience of being, of something alive that's just going to be there, that just is. It's just there. So that's not so threatened by constant change because it doesn't really matter what changes. That's still going to be there. And that's really the biggest value. The words are not really sufficient here, but the biggest value of coming out of the mind is that you find an essential identity that's not constantly threatened by change, that can find itself in any moment and in any circumstance. And then the surface of reality and all of its changes take a secondary place in your attention. And your primary focus is always on that constancy, that isness, what Buddhists call suchness. It's just so. Or what in medieval Catholic scholasticism, which was a philosophy in the Middle Ages, was called quiddity, which comes from the Latin quid, which is like thatness. It's just like suchness. It's another word for just this isness of things. But when you come to an experience of that isness of things, there's not so much a threat, because everything is. No matter what form it's taking, it has that isness. This is very abstract to the mind and makes no sense if you're watching this video thinking about what I'm saying. But if you let yourself feel, maybe hear what's being said, feel the words, feel the meaning, maybe you can start to experience for yourself, what is that presence beyond ideas about how things are? What are you beyond your ideas about yourself or your ideas about what things are? What is that deeper experience within you that just is? So the significance of coming out of thought is that you stop trying to find yourself in so many pieces that will inevitably fade away. And so you stop fighting with a changing reality and come into something more fundamental that is no matter what's happening. It's just an isness that is constant and in that sense at ease.